Thanks for coming. The event is being co-hosted by a number of organisations, the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, the National Resources Defence Council and IChemE Institute for Chemical Engineers in the UK. My name's Rob Gross, I'm your chair, and I'm the Director of a Research Centre on Energy Policy and Technology at Imperial College. And if I could briefly introduce my fellow panellists. Our speakers are Dr. Rachel Hall from the Energy Centre at the IChemE, Mark Apsey, who's also from the Energy Centre at IChemE. I've got my colleague from the Imperial College Business School, Charley Donovan, and from National Resources Defence Council, NRDC, I've got Doug Sims. Now, unfortunately, we were also to have been joined by Gavin Temperton from the Green Investment Bank, but there was some kind of mix-up with his pass, and so unfortunately he's not been able to get into the event, so that's a shame. Despite that, I will be holding my fellow panellists quite strictly to time, guys. I see that as my main role. I'm going to ask them all to speak for 8 to 10 minutes. And we're running in the order that I've just introduced people in. So the first speaker is Rachel, who's going to be talking to us about mitigation options for low carbon energy.
Carbon dioxide is the largest component of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Energy alone is estimated to account for 68% of these emissions, with the largest single source coming from the combustion of fossil fuels. Global population is expected to reach 8.5 billion by 2030 and 11.2 billion by the end of the century. Demand on global resources will be ever increasing in line with the predicted global development and industrialisation. Energy production is a key challenge and central to this. So, how do we decarbonise our energy systems while continuously improving our global living standards for all in a sustainable way that can ensure energy security for future generations? This is no trivial challenge. It will require substantial changes to the way we live, the technology we use, and the way we work. But there are solutions that have exciting potential, and I'd like to present a few of those to you today. For now, the near future, and for the horizon. The basis of my presentation is set around the Institution of Chemical Engineers Chemical Engineering Matters Initiative, which has produced 4 vistas around energy, water, food and well-being. They show a pathway as to how chemical engineering can support the development of sustainable solutions for our future challenges. Shown here is the technology pathway for the energy vista. My initial focus for the now is carbon mitigation. For my first technology, it is more of a behavioural change applicable across all sectors and walks of life, and something we can contribute to together. Resource efficiency and energy efficiency. Promoting step change improvements in our existing processes in an efficient way is ensuring resource efficiency while reducing energy consumption. I'll give you 2 examples of where we can do this. Investment in reliable monitoring systems to monitor our processes to make sure they run at optimal level, but also to be able to monitor when they change away from this so we can rapidly remedy it. Secondly, better use of our waste streams from our process industries, encouraging process integration where possible. This can be applied across all energy pathways and will continue to play a part in all aspects of energy production from now and into the future. Every joule efficiently used is reducing the carbon load, allowing us to move closer to that low carbon target. To my next technology. The technology with the biggest potential in the here and now is CCS. Carbon capture and storage offers the opportunity to decouple the use of fossil fuels from climate change Our innate reliance on these materials will not be quenched overnight. Fossil fuels will still be required in the short to medium term. There is an urgent need for its deployment to achieve necessary emission reductions commitments. In terms of the technology, CO2 separation is a mature technology. Transportation of CO2 has been proven at scale. Storage has also been proven for many years in deep saline aquifers. It should not be forgotten the platform of CCS, when combined with biomass to power systems, could provide one of the few negative carbon emission systems, which would allow the atmospheric CO2 to be captured in the fuel crop, then providing energy for power and heat, with emissions captured and stored. At this point, there is no current bio-CCS plant existing at scale, but it will be needed to meet our targets in a timely fashion. In terms of cost, as highlighted by a recent UK parliamentary report, CCS remains the lowest cost option to decarbonisation. Without its implementation, reliance on low carbon energy will mean greater increased fuel prices in the future. CCS is by no means a final solution, but is a very much needed bridging technology. It is a proven technology, but which will provide the much needed breathing room for development and adoption of low carbon solutions until they can consistently support the demand for energy. And so to the future. The growth in renewable technologies has been rapid, particularly for solar and wind. In 2015, their capacities were at 432 gigawatts and 227 gigawatts respectively. And this is set to look to rise by 2030 to over 1,000 gigawatts for wind and 900 for solar. However, for these technologies to reach their full potential and overcome intermittency limitations, a key enabler is needed. Energy storage. This will be key to the continued growth and development of an adoption of the sustainable low-carbon technologies. Pumped hydro currently accounts for 95% of the energy storage in the world. It is a mature technology, long-lived, but has the disadvantage of being expensive and also geographically limited. Therefore, research and investment is needed across the full spectrum of potential storage solutions to maximise the viability of the sector. In the near to mid-term, this could look like mechanical storage of energy through flywheels, or batteries, or thermal. In the longer term, the opportunity looks bright, for example, through thermochemical systems using reversal chemical reactions, advanced batteries such as metal air or advanced flow batteries. This sheer diversity of potential technology is likely to provide a solution in every renewable integration opportunity. This brings me to the horizon, the ultra-low to zero carbon target. Using technology I've already mentioned, we will need to develop smart networks, intelligent grids. We will need to develop smarter energy management systems connected to flexible grid solutions and allow us to maximise potential and accessibility of intermittent renewable technologies. This will be achieved through integration of energy systems with information and communication technology to allow the energy demand to be met by a reliable, efficient, fast and flexible energy supply. The horizon is a carbon-free power system. This will be achieved through intelligent distribution systems connected to advanced storage to provide resilience and capacity. We know where we are now. We know where we want to be. To achieve this, we need to invest in the future by continually looking ahead, building our vision and supporting a strong research base to find the innovative solutions to this global challenge, from within nature, across industries, over polar subject areas, and develop a collaborative, open-minded network of experts and enthusiasts. In conclusion, every step forward is a positive one. The technology availability is not a constraint. There are many viable, promising technologies I have not mentioned today. But there is no one solution fits all. Diversity is key in finding that most regionally appropriate technology. And my final words, an ever-involving work of science and engineering can offer the solutions. But of course, to achieve this vision, we will need substantial stability from government policies and regulatory frameworks, and the support of key stakeholders, investors and institutions, to ensure that the immediate action necessary can be sustained into the future. Thank you for listening.
Next speaker is Mark, also from IChemE. I think moving on less from talking about sort of big picture solutions, more towards project delivery. Okay,
thank you, and hello everyone. So we've heard about some great existing technologies and a whole lot of new technologies that are just around the corner. But the question I really want to ask is, why can't we deliver more of these energy efficiency and renewable projects faster and across all types of organisation? And really, whatever the technology we're looking at, to get and realise the benefits, we have to follow the very same project processes. So that involves a little bit of thinking at the beginning to work out what the opportunities might be, then a decision about whether to keep going and develop the project a bit further. If we get a yes decision, then we can spend some time doing a bit more thinking, coming up with a full business case, so we can work out the exact costs and benefits of the project, and then hopefully make an investment decision at that point. And that's the point where we can really start to make a difference, because we can actually deliver out the projects and build them and commission them and realise the benefit. And it sounds really simple, but the reality is it's actually quite difficult, and there are a lot of barriers to getting through a project process, even if a project would appear to save money and carbon and energy. One such block relates to the fact that actually energy costs are quite low, and they might be quite insignificant in an organisation's operating budget, in which case they're not a priority. So people don't even start to look for the opportunities that might exist within an organisation or asset base. And that means no one makes any money available to do that and look at it. There's a million other things to do when you're running an organisation. So actually, spending time on what is not core business, which is sorting out your energy problem perhaps, is really not worthwhile. If you do start looking at opportunities, and then you get to a point where you may have an investable business case, a lot of organisations have very high internal rate of return requirements. So what tends to happen is projects, or deep energy saving projects that make a real difference, get shelved at that point effectively, because organisations have better, actually perhaps not better, but perhaps other ways to spend their money with quicker paybacks. And then organisations have a fear of disruption. They don't actually want the hassle of putting projects into their organisation. Perhaps there are concerns over whether the savings will really materialise, and many concerns over whether incentives that perhaps underpin a business case might disappear with policy changes or government changes. So wrapping around all of that means that there is an inherent short-termism, I think, in organisations' ability to grapple with the energy efficiency problem. And perhaps that's human nature, but what it means is there's really no pressure, or very limited pressure, to act quickly and make a difference. So how can we really try to start to overcome and unblock some of these barriers to accelerate deployment? Well, I think there's a couple of very traditional approaches. So first of all, we can look at encouragement. We can look at incentive schemes, and many countries do have renewable power generation incentives and renewable heat incentives. And I would suggest that perhaps an energy saving incentive for organisations that rewards them for cutting their base energy consumption may be something else to look at. We can also look at taxes. And indeed, many countries have already introduced taxes on power and fuel consumption, which go some way to perhaps increasing maybe awareness of the climate change impact of consumption, but are perhaps not set at the right levels to make a difference. But perhaps we could look at that so that the energy costs are boosted and can make a significant difference in these business cases. The other way to look at things is through enforcement. And to my mind, there's very little enforcement that requires organisations to currently reduce their carbon emissions and energy consumption. So perhaps we could look at mandatory reporting of emissions and also identification of opportunities which might encourage companies, or enforce and require companies, in fact, to make a difference. And as a chemical engineer, health and safety is something that's very core to what we do. So I think there's perhaps an opportunity to learn from health and safety legislation that does mandate action to keep people safe. And in the UK, we've long had a concept of as low as reasonably practicable when it regards to protecting human life from misfortune and accidents. And the punishments associated with not doing that are significant. They can result in personal prosecutions for people within organisations, but also significant fines for failure to comply. Now, of course, environmental emissions are different. With health and safety, you might have an accident that triggers an investigation and then leads to these sorts of outcomes and prosecutions. But perhaps with mandatory reporting of emissions and declaration of what the opportunities are, we could use those as triggers to investigate and hold companies and organisations to account to deliver a change. So these are quite familiar levers, but either encouragement or enforcement requires levels to be set at a significant level to drive action. On the incentive side, the rewards per kilowatt hours saved or carbon saved need to be worthwhile. And by way of example, I did a quick calculation looking at the EU ETS price and what that might add to a gas bill, and it works out to be about 6%. And that's really not significant enough to drive people to look at reducing a gas bill. And in fact, I look at a lot of business cases, and EU ETS is very rarely, and the benefits from avoiding those charges is very rarely the deciding factor between a yes or no decision on a project. But what else can we do to try and accelerate and unblock projects? Well, one of the problems I mentioned was in the early stages of trying to find resources to actually identify opportunities, and perhaps some form of government support by way of a loan or a grant to support investment in identifying opportunities will go some way to alleviate that. Other ideas might include support for new technologies. We heard about quite a few from Rachel, and the fact is new technologies need support to go through cycles of iteration and learning such that they do become commercially viable and of interest to organisations. And then the other big problem that I did mention was the availability of capital. A lot of organisations will not use their own capital to invest in these projects because the paybacks don't meet their payback criteria. And this is where investment funds, such as the Green Investment Bank model, which we're going to hear quite a bit about in a minute, could really help to try and unlock those projects that otherwise just would not get done. And that in conjunction with education around energy performance contracting as a model to support third-party investment. Because investors, as with anyone, need confidence that they're going to get a return on the investment. And that is an established model in the US that can really help to unlock some of these funds and deliver projects. I've put a couple of other ideas up there as well. So I've mentioned green bonds. And having spoken to some of my friends in the investment industry, I know this is potentially a controversial area. Green bonds can be great. In the US, they've offered tax breaks to bond issuers when money supports low carbon projects. But the downside is they can distort markets. And whilst they can provide a really low, cheap source of money for projects, there's an argument that then other money holds out and doesn't invest because they're just waiting for the next slice of cash. And of course, there's infrastructure projects that can be done, which Rachel has mentioned as well, regarding CCS and smart grids and so on. So I'd just really like to finish up by saying what we really need to do is tackle the short-termist view and the uncertainty by having a long-term energy strategy. I think we often hear about the conflict and tension between the key priorities of energy security, energy affordability, and then low carbon or energy efficiency, as I've grouped there. And in fact, I've heard government departments openly say that low carbon solutions are at the bottom of that priority list, and I understand that. We need to keep the lights on, and particularly we also need to make sure that energy is affordable so that people don't lose the basic provision of heat or cooling and light for their families. But I would like to suggest that if we can really tackle energy efficiency and low carbon solutions in the ways that we've talked about, with low carbon distribution, then we can start to actually improve energy security and drive down energy costs. And rather than a tension, perhaps we could move more towards a virtuous cycle of improvement, which supports all three in a complementary way. Now, I prepared these slides before the US presidential election last week, but I like this quote from another famous American, Abraham Lincoln, who said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." And I would just like to make a final plea and finish up by saying what we really need are very clear energy strategies for the long term that give confidence to both investors and organisations to get on and implement some of these great projects and technologies that exist now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm moving straight on now to Charley Donovan. Charley's got a long track record in the energy industry, in the financial end of the energy industry before joining us at Imperial in the business school. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? How many people in this room have heard of a company called Enron? Okay. Now, 15 years ago, I was working for Enron. And to this month is about the time when I walked out of that building for the last time. And I have to tell you that at Enron, we were very good at innovative finance. And so when I hear the title of this talk, Innovative Finance for Climate, I have to tell you I get very worried. The hairs on the back of my neck go up. Because innovative finance at Enron was what? Well, we could make debt magically disappear. We could take an energy hedge fund and have its earnings look like a boring old utility. That was innovative finance. And it ultimately led to the downfall of that company and a number of other ones as well. So I have to tell you with this talk, innovative finance for me is a very, very loaded word, and one that I think is very misunderstood. And with the amount, I've only been here for 24 hours and I've heard innovative finance 24 times. Now, you don't have to be a finance professor to work out the ratio. But there's something going on there that people have a huge expectation about innovative finance. And unfortunately, I think that that expectation is misplaced. And I'm going to spend with you a few minutes telling you why. Now, what I do at Imperial College in the business school is we have a number of things that happen all across the college, but we have, as of today, launched a new Center for Climate Finance and Investment within the business school. We're very happy to provide you with one of our little brochures. And the proposition running and why we have done this is a realization that mainstream investors, those people who are asset owners of trillions and trillions of dollars of capital, are massively disconnected from this process. This to them is an insular, small, closed shop of people convincing themselves of what they already know. And we feel like that's not true, but that there is a recognition that what is going on here and what is going on in numerous places around the world with the importance of this issue is not making it into boardrooms, is not making it into the investment decision process within mainstream financial institutions. And as a business school, we hope that we can help change that, and even in just a little way. When I teach classes on finance, and I'm always surprised, folks who are engineers and come into my class and they are scared of finance. They think it's complex. And I'm always shocked by that, because here are people who know how to build bridges and know how to build skyscrapers, things that I could never do. And yet they think that finance is complex. In fact, it's really simple. It's really, really simple. And maybe we preserve our good job prospects and our high salaries by convincing people that it is complex, but it really isn't. All you really need to know is one thing, and that's the return, the financial return, how much profit I earn as an investor is a function of how much risk I take on. And if it's low risk, I can do one thing, and if it's high risk, I can do another. To make it even more simpler, the one thing that I can do when it's low risk is I can loan you money. And when it gets more risky, I have to become an owner. I have to take equity. And there's this continuum between debt and equity, which perfectly describes that relationship. Now, if we could do all of the things that you've talked about, and we could borrow at government bond rates, which now in the developed world are somewhere between 1% and 2%, we'd have this problem solved pretty quickly. Because the cost of capital for doing it would be so low that these projects, many of which are not economic, would become so. But that's not the world that we live in. And in fact, over the last 20, 30 years, governments have been actively pushing out from themselves the role of being investors in the energy sector, in the infrastructure sectors, and asking the private sector to do it instead. That's come with some efficiencies, but what it's done is raise the cost of capital for investment. Because now we're not talking about borrowing only at government bond rates to finance these projects, we're asking corporations to do them. And so the next piece of this puzzle as you go up the triangle is the corporate rate of investment, which if you look across the EU, the US ranges about 7%. That's a big jump from 1 to 2%. And then finally, if you ask, well, it's actually a pretty risky project too, and corporations wouldn't be interested, and we need to go to some specialist players like private equity funds, well, now we're here into 15, 30% return on investment that's required in order for those projects to come to life. So what can innovative finance do? Well, it can do some things. I don't want to leave that as entirely an opening for scandal and market abuse, but there's a lot of things that it can't do. You cannot make up with finance for market risk. If I can't export my power, there's nothing you're going to be able to do in the financing arrangements that's going to help me. If you don't have rule of law, there's nothing that a financing arrangement is going to do to cover that up. You also can't overcome technology risks. Technology risk is a binary issue for which banks and financial institutions either find it attractive or they don't. And you certainly can't make up for a lack of consumer interest. And where consumers don't indicate an interest, if there is not a certain pricing on top, a tax, whatever it is, then there's really nothing to do. It's only in the rarest cases where finance can make up for an uneconomic project. It happens, and in the next slide I'll show you why. But what innovative finance can do is all those things in green. When it's the first of a kind, when you try to create scale through securitization, when you manage specific financing risks like currency and interest rates. But you can't make up for an underlying project which in market terms makes no sense. Now, to try to illustrate this point, this is a piece of work that we did for the Grantham Institute this year, saying that if you imagined that you could build out solar PV in India at the cost of capital that you're able to do it in the US, what would that mean for tariffs? What would that mean for how much subsidy implicitly would have to be provided to make those projects go? And if you wanted to do 2 gigawatts of solar, you could find $5.4 billion for other government priorities simply by getting the cost of capital down from the private sector rate in India to the private sector rate in the United States. That's a massive amount of money that can go for hospitals, for education, for things that are really important as well. And so this issue comes up. How do you do all these things we need to do, but do them for the best bang for buck? How do you do them most efficiently? How do you find a way to squeeze as much as possible enough projects through? And the litmus test for that, for any type of innovative finance, I would like to suggest to you, is one simple question. Have you reduced the cost of capital for private sector investors? Because we will not get there on the back of public finance. It is hugely valuable, and there is no disputing its need. But private sector investment is what we need. We need trillions, not hundreds of billions. And this is where we have to go. And this is what I would suggest where public money increasingly needs to be placed, is things that underwrite and provide leverage for more private sectors, mainstream private sector investors to come into play. Now, there was a question about the Green Investment Bank. And fortunately, although Gavin is not here, this is an organization we've spent a lot of time studying, and we've written a business case study. For any of you who are interested, happy to send it to you. What the Green Investment Bank has done is actually innovative in the sense that it's tried to act like a commercial bank with a social mission. And if Gavin was here, I'm sure he would tell you they have not in one iota relaxed what are the commercial standards associated with lending to solar, to wind, to waste to energy efficiency. But what they have found is new ways of making that happen. So 4 years on, 2.7 billion committed, and now being sold. And now being sold. And my point of view about that is great, because we urgently need that capital to be recycled right back into another green investment bank, or right back into other mechanisms which play a commercial role and help us find a way towards crowding in more private sector investors. Doug, I will leave to you the specifics, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Doug Sims of the NRDC, and Doug, I think, is going to expand on the theme of the role of green banks. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks. Hi, Doug Sims, NRDC. NRDC is an environmental organization based in the U.S. We have offices all over the U.S. and also in China, and a lot of activities in India. So we have sort of a global view on this topic, clean energy financing, clean energy policy, plus the entire gamut of adaptation and mitigation challenges. So since Gavin couldn't be here, I'm going to finish up the UK GIB points before I do my presentation. So I think, as you'll see, there's many models to what a green investment bank can be, and one was in the UK, and I would agree that the mission of the green bank, the particular flavor in the UK, was to be, as Gavin says, green and profitable. So the UK Green Investment Bank has sought to demonstrate to the market that certain investments in sectors where they saw underinvestment are indeed profitable. I think where I would supplement the previous speaker would be saying that the Green Investment Bank has definitely done things that the private market has not done, because they have the in-house capacity to understand projects that were not being done in the UK prior to their getting involved. So 3 points that Gavin wanted me to explain to this audience are as following. First is, their success is because of the in-house expertise, financial and technical engineering expertise, that allow them to understand the real risks and opportunities presented by these projects. The problem with mainstream commercial finance, the banks, and of course the long-term investors, is that they don't have the capacity to understand some of these projects. When you invest in the dedicated institution to do that, you get a different outcome, and you can actually catalyze more investment. The second point he wanted me to underscore was their success is due to their focus only on this sector, the green sector. Other institutions, we'll see this in my talk, have other focuses, but this institution is a specialized institution which only does this. So you would not be a stretch or even hard to think that they'd have a better and deeper insights as other specialists do into this market. The third point he wanted me to stress was that the UK Green Investment Bank has succeeded because of a strong underlying enabling environment, meaning the policies that support investment in these sectors in the UK. Moving on to my presentation. Let me first say that the topic of the paper is green and resilience banks, how this model can be applied to scaling up climate finance in emerging markets. And this is basically, most of it's from a paper which is coming out today, which will be available on the COP website, produced by NRDC, Coalition for Green Capital, Rob Youngs, who is here, and also Ken Berlin, I think, is in the room, and also Climate Finance Advisors, which is an advisory group out of Washington, D.C. So this is our paper, which you can download, available today. And I think if we've heard the background a lot, just to quickly touch on this slide, the transition to a new kind of economy well below 2 degrees really requires shifts in investment. So the deal has been done, now it's about changing the investment patterns around the world. Those investment patterns will go from the so-called developed countries to ones that are either emerging or developing. That creates new challenges, investing in those environments. This requires something called greening finance, which means helping mainstream institutions to provide most of the capital change their practices and understanding of this sector. It also requires what we call green finance, which essentially is doing more green projects, which is what green banks do. So it's one, greening finance is helping the mainstream guys do things differently. Green finance is directly investing in the sector in green projects. And they're synergistic because every time a mainstream investor does a project with a green bank, they understand the sector better. So they're both having the same outcomes. The big challenge also we're seeing is the model that infrastructure usually has been centralized, whereas a large part of it now will be distributed in different forms. That's a big challenge for finance because traditional infrastructure financing is about financing big things, which is what the infrastructure finance world is going up around. Now it's being refashioned to aggregate small projects to make them big. So a big part of what can help this happen, and we've seen in developed countries, is specialized institutions that are built to do this kind of activity. So quickly, the green bank, investment bank model, we'll say what it is in a second. It's attracting attention from a lot of the folks thinking very hard about how do we solve climate change in terms of changing investment. The UN has highlighted the capacity of banks to foster institutional innovation and partner with other institutions to drive change. The OECD has also focused on the fact that centralizing expertise in a new institution adds value to the existing cast of institutions that are already investing around the world. And the G20 has emphasized that there's been success already in showing that these institutions can drive in additional private finance. The big point to recognize is that the G20 has also said that even in a place like China, which has pretty massive amounts of public capital, 80% of the investment needed to drive the climate mitigation adaptation markets will come from the private sector. We must have that capital. So what are the key findings in our paper? Quickly, green investment banks can provide a national and local solution to close financing gaps. What does that mean, national and local? National means based on the country's priorities and controlled by the country. What does that mean, local? Local means designed to meet local conditions. How does it do this? It can help countries articulate and develop their nationally determined contributions in ways that are interesting to domestic and international investors, and which also comply with their agreements requirements. They also can be locus of innovation for institutions. I don't have the same fear of innovation as my colleague did. Innovation this is necessary in all sectors, and unfortunately Enron also has something called fraud, which we never need. So we don't have any fraud, we need innovation. We need bringing different ideas to this sector. And also being a critical partner to the existing development finance institutions to help them target their funding to the right kinds of projects based on local conditions. So in sum, these GIBs can be a conduit between on the ground in the country and international and domestic institutional and commercial finance. So what is a green bank? Now this is quickly, the green bank sort of sits here and it does two things. It works with capital providers like banks and institutional investors who are risk averse. They don't understand clean energy. They have no experience with clean energy. So the green bank provides a little bit of its capital to reduce some of the risk to those institutions, to bring them into transactions so they understand them and want to do more. It also works on the other side. This is something which I think also some green banks work to actually stoke demand of the consumers. Consumers, building owners, for example, for energy efficiency, They may have misperceptions about how complex it is. They may have fears about whether or not energy bills will actually be reduced. Contractors who want to get involved in building things may not understand how to get involved in a new area. Some green banks work to stoke demand, or demonstrating that demand can in fact be impacted by working with the market participants to drive demand for clean energy. They do many of the things that existing institutions do, but they bring them together in a new way. The most important is their narrow mandate, as Gavin was saying, their focus on clean energy, their cost effectiveness. They want to make sure they make good use of public capital. They make sure they are doing additionality. They're not doing projects which would otherwise be done. And they're also used to serve policy and market needs. So the green banks that exist, there are 13 of them worldwide under the OECD report released earlier this year. And they don't act in a vacuum. They act as part of a solution set of different policies necessary to make the transition. Carbon pricing, removal of subsidies, targeted incentives, etc. They don't work in a vacuum, but when they are there, they're very effective. We know this because they're actually leveraging private capital. In a few short years, the banks have actually, these 6 banks, which are not half of the 13, have deployed $6.3 billion in capital, and that's caused them to catalyze $22 billion. Yes, a small drop in the bucket, but this is only with 2 or 3 years of experience for most of these banks, and only in a few economies. How do you create a green bank? There's different approaches. Through legislation, you can do it through regulatory or administrative action, or by repurposing a different entity with new people and new money to do its mission. One source of capital, well, most of the green banks in the OECD countries have taken sources of capital from public sources, but public domestic sources, from budgets, cap and trade, utility surcharges. As we look towards the future, we're going to see another opportunity is through climate finance. The Green Climate Fund, for example, could capitalize an emerging market green bank. Very important to explore this opportunity more deeply. Okay, a word about green banks and green bonds, since people ask this question a lot. A green bond is a bond whose bond proceeds are used for green projects. A green bank can issue green bonds to fund its own projects. And various green banks have actually worked on trying to grow this market. The important thing about this market is that it has to have green standards. You can't have projects that are being financed that are not green and being called a green bond. So as these projects have standards that are clear and understandable, investors that want green projects will redirect their capital to green bonds. This is the opportunity. So what are the green banks doing right now? There's Malaysia. There's been a focus on getting commercial banks into the sector. In Japan, they've tried to increase local projects in areas affected by the earthquake and natural disasters by doing equity investments. The UK has tried to focus on bringing in institutional capital into offshore wind. Australia has done a lot of different things. One of them is to actually buy green bonds to demonstrate their viability to other investors in the Australian market. So, as we were talking about earlier, in the emerging markets, there's other challenges that are being faced. And the green bank model will have to evolve to face those challenges. They're the same challenges that are present in the OECD, but just on a deeper scale. And some new wrinkles like currency risk and energy access and poverty. So the model will have to evolve to really deal with these issues. So what are some things that green banks could do in emerging markets? This is not saying that green banks are the only institutions that could do this, but here's what they could do. Currency hedging mitigation in emerging markets, where your local currency is not convertible, and international investors want to make sure that they get their returns. The Global Innovation Lab is developing these products which could be tested around the world in green banks. Energy savings insurance for energy efficiency. You want to lower your energy bill. You want to invest in energy efficiency. If you don't believe that the savings are going to materialize, provide insurance. Bottom of the pyramid solar investments are ones which allow distributed solar, off-grid solar in emerging markets. How do we innovate that? How do we make sure that those business models are being empowered? The green banks are well positioned to do that if they're designed for these local markets. What can green banks do? Green banks can serve as really a coordinating role, coordinating entity to bring together different kinds of capital who want to invest in this space, but for various reasons do not do so. That includes institutional investors, that includes impact investors, ones who want to get other than commercial returns. That includes development finance institutions who have a broad mandate for development. That includes donors. That includes climate finance. That includes domestic investors. This is an institution which can bring together these sources of funds and help drive implementation of the Paris commitments, while also driving additional investment and growth in emerging and developing economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ma question est très simple par rapport à la finance verte. Et quelle est la place de l'humain? Est-ce que la finance verte, comme l'autre finance, sera au service du profit sans limite, ou bien alors la finance verte a autre objectif où la solidarité, l'humain est au centre?
I would, in my opinion, I think green finance, by focusing on climate change and adaptation, is different than normal finance. So it has other kinds of goals. So to that extent, it is, but it also must be profitable. It must cover the return requirements of the investors. And I think some investors, in this picture, for example, the impact investors, measure their return in human development as well as economic development. They blend those returns, but most mainstream investors, put the finance, the economic part first. But I think green finance is integrating these elements as a core aspect of what they're trying to achieve.
I actually have a quick question for Dr. Hall. With respect to CCS, and I appreciate you talked about it as a bridging technology, and we need an integrated approach and everything else. But I was actually a little surprised to hear you talk about some of its technical feasibilities now. My understanding is with the sort of vapor recompression requirements required, I mean, you're looking at a 30 to 40% sort of energy cost, and that you really can't, you're almost offsetting the types of gains you're going to get from sequestering just through the technology of trying to recompress the gas. And there are concerns with storage and everything else.
I think the fact is we've got an energy gap coming up if we want to just stop using fossil fuels straight away. And as I said in my talk, it's not a solution by any means. It is a bridging technology to allow the low carbon energy systems to come online and actually meet that demand, because we want to keep the lights on. We want to keep sustainable living standards for everybody. We want to have those standards improving all the time. So yes, I suppose it's not the most efficient process, but the technology has been proven, but it is the commitments by governments to, if they want to keep the lights on, they might have to do it.
My question follows on the question of the previous speaker, and it's specifically about bioenergy with CCS. CCS is not yet working financially. It's been promised to us for the last 20 years for some of the reasons that have been pointed out here. But the hair-raising thing for us is BECCS, the idea that we would take a part of the landscape that is variously reckoned to be of the size of India, or 2 Indias, or 3 Indias, in order to generate the biomass necessary to feed those plants, is a horror show from the biodiversity, the soil conservation, and the food security perspectives. And I would encourage those with an engineering and chemical background to speak to those with an ecologist, biology or agronomy background before they push the world down this rabbit hole of a technology whose dangers have scarcely been mentioned yet.
Yes, I completely do agree with you. I think growing energy crops necessarily specifically for bio-CCS is not a solution, because we don't want monocultures, we don't want to impact the biodiversity of the land. But if there's crops that are there that are marginal, grown on marginal land, or if there are wastes grown that are from other crops that are byproducts of those crops, potentially use those. So we do see that there is biological impact of those, and at the moment there is no bio-CCS pilot plants, full-scale plants online. So whether it happens is another decision to be done by the governments, and obviously that needs to include from the point of actually growing the crops, harvesting them, and actually making sure that the carbon cycle is abided to carefully. So
I just wanted to make one comment on that. I think no one would be suggesting that bioenergy with CCS is the utopian one solution. And I think actually, from an IChemE perspective, we've created Chemical Engineering Matters, which, as Rachel said at the beginning, doesn't just cover energy, which is one of the vistas, and bioenergy CCS is one of the potential solutions within that vista, but we have others on water and food and well-being, which are trying to really look at the whole system and the kind of conflict between the different uses that you could put land to, as well as looking at specific solutions for energy problems.
Mark, I know you questioned green bonds. We're up to about $80 billion in issuances, we think, this year. Charlie, you mentioned that the $100 billion that's being talked about in this conference being a tiny portion of the amount of the trillions that are being invested in all kinds of things worldwide. What's it going to take? If you go next door, you'll hear people saying we should stop everything and invest only in green. What's it going to take to change it so that most or all investments are part of the green solution, and things that aren't part of the solution are arguing about the 100 billion or whatever left over?
There's some very good work that the OECD just put out a few weeks ago about green bonds' role in decarbonization, and I think the big answer I would provide is that if you start with things like green bonds, which are very mainstream, low-risk thing, and you give that market integrity, then you start getting more and more of the institutional investors confident to invest in this area. So it's not, and I think the OECD says the potential in the 2020s is something like about 600 billion per year, which goes a way towards doing things. There's also other pathways like consumer finance, like bank finance, and it's important to recognize, I guess what I'll say to wrap it all together is that there's an ecosystem of finance which has to be put in place. So green bonds really are just one part of that. They are the end, they're the refinancing tool. So we need to have the early stage stuff financed, we need to have the projects financed, we need to have the small stuff bundled and repackaged and resold into things like green bonds, and capital can recycle.
Okay, Charlie.
I'd just say very quickly to the gentleman's concern about bioenergy and CCS that I don't think you have to worry, because it's not going to happen. There's really no way from an investment point of view that I could see within the next 2 decades that you could get to the point where those two technologies combined could become acceptable for the private sector. I just really can't see it. We can talk later about why, but I personally would feel not worried. The other thing about what's it going to take, on the converse, it's going to take, the things that are working have to be done much more. I mean, I'm shocked that, solar energy, solar PV, which is working, banks understand it. We need a massive scale out there, and that can happen, and that's trillions. I think that there's a disconnect somehow between the range of technologies that are possible and the ones that are actually already economic and can be done. And I would love to see more in terms of what can it take. I would love to see the things that work already that we just plow much more energy into expanding and scaling those, because that's the route to some solutions in my mind.
Thanks again to my colleagues at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, to IChemE and to NRDC for co-hosting this event. Thanks to all my panelists, and thanks to you all for your very thoughtful questions. Thank you very much.